Hello, it's Denise from the Kitchen Garden Homestead, and this is another episode of Up the Potting Shed. In this episode, I wanted to talk about how we go about keeping those young, tender plants safe from the cold, wet, and miserable weather that I'm experiencing. Well, not today, that I'm likely to experience in northwest Cumbria in April. So one thing that's useful for any gardener to understand is when your last average frost date is. And for me, that's about mid-May. I'll leave a link in the description and you can look up what your last frost date is. It's not an absolute guarantee. It's based on a calculation that's looked at the average last frost date from weather records that date back many, many years. So I guess the number one defence for our young and tender plants is knowledge and understanding. It's useful as gardeners to know what a tender plant compared to a hardy plant is. And of course there are degrees of tenderness as there are degrees of hardiness. Something that's hardy for some of my gardening friends that live down south isn't going to be hardy for me up here near the Scottish borders. Likewise, a plant that's tender for me isn't so tender for them. I'll leave a link in the description for more information on the difference between tender and hardy plants. I wanted to share some of my tips and tricks for keeping young and tender plants safe from the frost and the cold. So what do I mean by tender plants? Well, I mean plants like sweet peppers, chilies and tomatoes. These plants, we trick them basically. They evolved to grow in much nicer climates than northwest Cumbria in the UK. They're used to dry, warm conditions, and I'm giving them cold, damp, and at the moment, icy conditions. You see, as gardeners, we're always manipulating the environment to trick plants into doing something that's beneficial for us rather than them. So in the case of these chilies and tomatoes, these have been germinated on a heat mat or sometimes in a propagator. So these have been in a Super 7 propagator, as have the tomatoes. That tricks the seed into thinking it's in its natural environment. The weather's warmed up and it's warm enough for it to germinate, grow and thrive. So of course it germinates, but it's germinated into an environment that, as I mentioned, it's northwest Cumbria. We don't have the light levels that these plants were expecting. So the best advice I can give you is hold your horses. Don't be too eager and excited to get those young plants and seedlings out into greenhouses, potting sheds and polytunnels. If you have to, however, we've got a few options, and it's all about finding creative ways of keeping them under cover. Create little microclimates for them. So here we've got some bubble wrap, cheap as chips to buy, but also, I mean, anything that comes delivered in bubble wrap, I'm going to save that for this time of the year. If it drops down to 5 degrees outside and I use this to shelter these plants, I can create a little micro environment. Let's take a look in the greenhouse and I'll show you some other creative ways that I'm using to keep those plants nice and toasty when the temperature drops down. This is what my chili peppers look like when I come to check them in the morning. I use bubble wrap to drape around them, completely enclosing them to create a little microclimate. Look, it's like a little tent where I trap all the heat of the day inside, and that keeps them toasty.
It's kind of held together with clothes pegs and bits of old bamboo, anything lying around really. But another thing to consider are the gaps in a lot of greenhouses. I'm lucky, this is a rhino, and it's kind of almost held together in a similar way to double glazing. It's completely sealed. If you've got gaps, you could try insulating them just to stop some of that draft getting in. It makes a little bit of a difference. So if you can just bring the temperature up by 1 or 2 degrees, you create a nicer environment for those tender plants.
So if the weather tells me it's going down to 5 degrees C, I'm not too concerned. I'm going to be pulling out the bubble wrap because I think I'm going to be getting about 7 degrees in here, and I think that's going to be fine for the chilies, sweet peppers and the tomatoes. These experienced what we call a stall if they get exposed to cool temperatures. Ideally, they want to be 10 degrees or above to grow and to thrive and to grow well. Anything below that and they slow right down, and they could in fact stall. Now, when a plant stalls, it kind of goes into hibernation. But here's the thing, and this is my theory based on my personal experience. I think these tomatoes are going to have to experience low temperatures, prolonged low temperatures, before they think about hibernating, because I'll expose these to maybe 3 degrees overnight. But the thing is, by 7 o'clock in the morning, it's warmed up significantly, so that they're only ever exposed to a low temperature for a couple of hours. And I don't personally believe that's enough to send them into hibernation. I think they'll get a boost of heat in the day. I think what we have to worry about if we get an extreme drop in temperature where it's going to be below 10 degrees for a number of days. If that happens,
If I think the temperature's going to drop below 5 degrees C, I can use my paraffin heater. It's really handy and it really can boost the temperature in the greenhouse significantly. I use both of the burners. You light it with a match, pretty easy going. And with both burners on quite low, I can keep it at about 10 degrees. I don't want it much hotter than that. And in fact, I don't really like to use it if I can help it, because I don't think the fumes do the plants much good. But it's a great option to have, and they're not very expensive to buy.
now another intermediary form of protection that I employ is some polystyrene. And you can see there's a sheet up there alongside that window. So, if I think we're just going to have a blast of cold and I want to protect the tomatoes a little bit, I actually put polystyrene along those back windows, and I might even drape a little bit of bubble wrap over the tomatoes. But most of the seedlings that I have in here are actually quite cold tolerant. So here we've got some brassicas. I mean, they can grow through winter. Now, a celery is quite tender. Your celery plant does not want to be exposed to anything under 10 degrees C for more than 12 hours. Otherwise, as a growing plant, this is liable to bolt. By bolting, we mean grow too quick and go to seed before it's developed into something that we want to eat. But that's interesting. Think about that. I said that this is tender and is liable to bolt if it's exposed to a temperature lower than 10 degrees C for more than 12 hours. This is something we need to consider. Is a tomato plant at mortal risk if it's exposed to, say, 1 degree C for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours? And my argument would be, I think it's going to cope. I don't think it's going to spin into a cycle of hibernation based on those couple of hours, and certainly not if the sun comes out
at say 7 o'clock in the morning, and by 10 o'clock the greenhouse is so hot I'm having to shade it and open the windows, I think that tomato plant's going to be pretty okay. However, if the weather forecast is set to be at 3 degrees for a number of days, that's another matter. That could be enough, combined with low light temperatures, to send that tomato plant into a cycle of hibernation. So as gardeners, it's a constant balancing act. You know, are we going to plummet in the early hours of the morning down to a dangerously cold level, but only briefly, followed by a bright sunny morning that very rapidly pushes the greenhouse back up to 30 degrees C? That's the kind of juggling act that we're having to work with. You know, if you've got plants outside that you want to protect from the frost, get creative. A cardboard box over the top of a potato plant, that's going to protect those tender leaves from the frost. But here's another thing: if they do happen to get a little bit nipped by the frost, don't be in a rush to cut that frost damage off, because those frost burnt leaves can actually add a little bit of protection. So leave them on a little while until you start to see the growth recover, and then snip them off. Old bits of sheet, anything really, dustbin lids, milk cartons, anything that you can lay your hands on, that pop it over the top of a plant to create that little microclimate, just to protect them in those early hours of the morning when the temperature tends to drop. Whip them off in the morning, whip those covers off in the morning, because the plants are likely to be able to enjoy some really nice temperatures later on in the day. And remember, it's just a couple more weeks that we need to be patient. Before I leave you, I want to give you a quick update on how the polytunnel is going. Yay, we've broken ground, we have holes. I can almost imagine what it's going to look like. Come on, I'll take you outside, we'll have a look together. You've got a messy part in your garden, looks just like that, doesn't it? So this is the site of the polytunnel. So I'm siting it just to the side of my little orchard. Beyond the blackcurrant bushes there is where my secret garden is, a little microclimate that I'm creating to protect plants from the harsh winds that come in. Absolutely glorious day here today. It's just a joy to be out. I can hear lawnmowers in the distance.